When you think of Dracula, what exactly do you think of? Do you think of a well-dressed, well-mannered man with an Eastern European accent, slick-backed black hair, black cloak, fangs that stick out if he smiles, and a menacing look? That's what this Dracula movie developed. The 1931 Dracula starring Bela Lugosi. Let's talk about it and analyze it, see what it means in its historical context, coming up next. Now, this 1931 Dracula is based on a lot of things. First of all, the novel from Bram Stoker from 1897. Also, the filmmakers watched F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu from 1922, and they took a few things from it, but they also changed a ton of things. But also, there was a play and a Broadway show that had Dracula in it, and a couple of these actors in the 1931 movie from Universal Studios are from the Broadway original play, including Bela Lugosi himself. Now, this is the first Dracula with sound, so you're going to hear people talk. But what's also interesting to me, and this is what makes the movie great, is that Philip Glass, the famous modern classical composer, one of the few actual classical composers from the modern age that I listened to, he actually wrote a score to this movie in 1998. And on certain Blu-ray copies, check yours to see if this is on it, you can listen to Philip Glass's score along with the 1931 movie. I highly recommend doing this. The score adds so much extra dimension, intensity, emotion, but it's not like a horror movie soundtrack. And if you know Philip Glass and you've heard his music, you might actually find this to be a really interesting exercise. Having a composer come along 60, 70, 80 years later and redo a score for a movie or add a score to a movie. I hope those of you out there who are composers try this for silent movies, movies in the public domain, because if you're good enough, you can take an old movie and make it actually a lot better or a lot more, let's say, digestible for a modern audience with a brand new score to it. I think this is a great exercise for budding musicians to try. So anyway, you have to watch this with the Philip Glass score. Also watch this in HD because this Dracula is really good looking. Excellent, crisp, black shadows, dark tones to it. Wonderful cinematography here with the HD. Now the number...
I bid you welcome.
And really, I don't mean to demean what he did here, but a lot of what he did is just stare into the camera with one look. And the director, the editor, cinematographer really captured him very, very well. In fact, of course, as I said, he's the one who makes the cultural icon Dracula world famous. And, you know, if I think of Count Dracula, like Count Chocula and the Dracula in Sesame Street, and just any generic pop culture Dracula, they're probably derived from Bela Lugosi's performance in this movie. Part of that is because so many shots with him in it, showing him in full or just his face, are really, really well placed in this movie, almost perfect. In fact, for a modern viewer, you're going to see these sort of cheap special effect bats flying around, and you're going to think, oh, this movie's pretty hokey. But then a couple shots later, boom, you see Bela Lugosi in the frame, and he's got power and authority, a very charismatic-looking Dracula with just a single pose and a single look on his face. Now, this Dracula story is quite a bit different from the novel, and I find that this Dracula from 1931 is saying certain things. It's taking the Dracula story and it's narrowing it down to a couple major themes, at least from my point of view. One of the themes that comes up in this movie is the seduction of the young by a sort of well-mannered, well-dressed gentleman from Transylvania or Eastern Europe coming into England, seducing the young, perverting their minds, and actually controlling their minds in this movie. For example, the man who goes to Dracula's castle at first, in the novel or other movies, it's Jonathan Harker is the one who goes to Dracula's castle at the beginning of the story. Here, it's actually Renfield. Now, as you know, in the Dracula story, Renfield is Dracula's servant. He's obsessed with rats. He's just crazy. They put him in an asylum once he gets to England. But in this movie, he's a normal, sane guy riding a stagecoach. And when he gets to the peasants' hostel, they tell him, don't go to Dracula's castle. He doesn't listen, and then he goes to Dracula's castle, gets bitten by the Count, and thus becomes Dracula's slave forever. This is the first of many seductions by Dracula, where Dracula, once he goes to England and has Renfield help him out, is biting women on the neck, mind controlling them, and he's actually taking over in this movie the young people who can't control themselves. He literally is able to tell them what to do, use sort of Jedi mind powers on them, and get them to do what he wants.
And after you deliver the message, you will remember nothing, I now say. Obey.
Now the young are seduced here, but the old Professor Van Helsing is not. There's a scene in which Dracula tries to get him to do what he wants with mind control. Van Helsing is able to resist. That's because he's an older man, he's well studied, and I find him to be modeled on sort of a stereotype, the psychology professor type, or maybe psychoanalyst, who is able to understand the human ego and the id and the superego, and then ward off the Dracula figure with his learning and with his own mind developed. Thus, I think this movie puts a really heavy emphasis on psychology in the modern world. This is the early 1930s. At one point, Van Helsing is able to read the dreams and understand them of a young woman who's been bitten by Dracula. And you see this sort of psychoanalyst able to take on this seducer figure who is representative of the darker elements, of course, of human experience, maybe of the ego or the id itself. And in this movie, Van Helsing is the powerful character. The Dracula is his doppelganger, and these two are opposed by the end of the movie. But as I said, he sort of strikes me as a psychology professor. And thus, well, okay, the young don't have control of themselves, but this studied man does. And this being, the 1920s, 1930s, where psychoanalysis is on the rise in Europe and in the United States especially. And you get a lot of Hollywood movies where you have the psychoanalyst, the psychologist, as a hero of sorts who's able to understand the human heart and the human mind and fix social problems. That's what you see in this 1931 movie. There's also a heavy emphasis on Christianity versus anti-Christianity here, with Dracula being, of course, anti-Christian. At the beginning of the movie, Renfield has a cross around his neck. That stops Dracula temporarily. Later in the movie, throughout the movie, you see crosses throughout. And then later, Dracula is literally under a church abbey, and he's going to be rooted out, killed under the church abbey. He's perverted or corrupted the church, and thus he's trying to, undermine it, as it were. Literally being under the church, Van Helsing is able to stop him with a cross of sorts when he has, the wooden stake and he's pounding on it. I think this movie has very good cinematography. I think it's going to strike you as pretty modern. The blacks, the shadows are gothic in this movie, and you can see how movies like this in the gothic mode really influence noir movies that are just beginning to come out. The cinematography in this, certainly, given that it's a box office hit and a very famous movie at the time as well as later on, there's no doubt in my mind that there's overlap between the horror movies of the 20s and 30s, and then the noir crime movies that come out in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And in this movie, Dracula is a seducer, he is a perverse man, and he is taking over the minds and the wills of young people throughout England. It's obviously a cultural metaphor for, those kinds of perverse ideologies that are coming in and ruining the youth. I recommend this movie for its historical value, for, its iconic status. It'll tell you a little bit about yourself, where you get the Dracula ideas from, for example. It's hard not to watch this movie so that you know a little bit about your own pop culture history, let's say. Have you seen this movie? What do you think about it? Please leave us a comment. Let me know what you think about this analysis, what else you think is going on in this movie. And please subscribe to my channel for more great movie content. Thank you. Have a great day.